Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion about With the Grain, which is the exhibition that you are currently in, so you know about it. And you're going to learn a little bit more about it tonight. I want to introduce our speakers, but first I'll just say my name is Waguespack. I'm the head of Curatorial Affairs here at the New Mexico Museum of Art. I was the curator for this exhibition with a large amount of help from Jana. You're going to hear about all that later, too. But the idea behind this panel discussion was bringing in two of the curators from museums that loaned important pieces to this exhibition and learning a little bit more about the work that you see here from their point of view. So I have a few questions that are going to instigate discussion, but this is meant to be informal and fun. And so if you all have any questions or any points you would like people to elaborate on, feel free to just hop in and ask. And I think we're going to have a really fun evening. We are. I know. I don't think
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical.
Okay, we got one for sure, one skeptical, so we'll see. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Jadira Gurule. She is the Art Museum and Visual Arts Programs Manager for the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque. We're going to learn more about her in a minute in her own words. And Jana Gottshalk, who's the Curator of Collections, Education, and Public Programming. And anything else?
I actually cut it. I was like, do me a solid.
Is there anything you don't do?
I really need you to cut my... I'm like, let's just have curator. We all know I do those things anyway.
For the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art. And I will add that Jana used to also work here with us at the New Mexico Museum of Art before the Spanish Colonial Museum stole her away. And it was during that time when she and I were working together that we came up with the idea for this exhibition. So she deserves just as much credit or blame, depending on how much you like it or don't like it, for this coming here. So just to start, I wonder if you two can tell me a little bit more about yourselves. Can you talk about your background in the arts, your areas of interest, and the focus for your respective museums?
Should I go first? Okay, cool. Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. As Christian mentioned, my name is Jadira Gurule, and I'm with the National Hispanic Cultural Center Art Museum in Albuquerque. I have sort of a traditional, non-traditional background in the arts. I have a degree in art history, but then I went to graduate school in American Studies, and so a lot of my curatorial interest revolves around looking at identity and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, social justice, and kind of the discourse that museums participate in on a national scale. The NHCC is actually a multidisciplinary cultural center, so we have a performing arts center, history and literary arts, education, and then the art museum, which houses a collection, and our mission is actually global in scope, so we collect and work with artists who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Chicano, Latin American, Indigenous, and all of the other terms that kind of fall under those umbrellas. We could be here all night if I went into all of them. And yes, I've been with the center officially since 2016, but I was an intern there before. Christian was also an intern at the NHCC before. And yeah, did I cover all the components of that question?
I think so. How long has the NHCC Art Museum been in operation?
Since the year 2000. So the whole center opened in 2000. So we're about 23 years old, which is still kind of baby in the world of museums. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually,
we're just old enough to drink.
We're actually the same age.
Yeah?
Yeah, Spanish Colonial started in 2002, I think.
Oh, okay.
2000 as well.
So can we throw like
a party?
Old enough to drink
yeah.
party?
Yeah, I mean, we missed it by a couple years, but COVID happened, so yes, now's the time.
So I moved here in 2000, maybe. I went to school in Santa Fe, and then I have stayed. I actually went to school for painting and sort of ended up in museum work, which said no one ever because it's very hard to get into. So I started in Spanish colonial arts, and then I kind of started focusing on like the WPA era in New Mexico. So that's kind of one of my special interests. But now I'm back at the Spanish colonial arts, and you know, we're really trying to help drive the youth into really understanding the culture and the art, so I'm coming back into this, challenging the museum idea, the institution, challenging what our role is in terms of how we work with artists, and kind of in an exciting time because we get to question those things and we get to, find our niche and stuff like that. So.
And what's the scope of the collection?
So it is mostly, it has a Spanish colonial, post-contact and Spain and a little bit of Europe and a lot of South America, but it primarily is New Mexican art as far back as you can think.
Great. And for anybody who may not know, the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art is up on Museum Hill, so very easy to visit if you live in Santa Fe. And the National Hispanic Cultural Center is in downtown Albuquerque, right by the beautiful, beautiful Bosque.
Yes.
And if the art museum isn't enough of a draw, and it well should be, the whole center is just gorgeous, so it's definitely worth a visit.
I'll tell you later about all the cool things you can come do.
It's coming up. Okay, so the first section of this exhibition, which is the artwork that spans, you're entering here to these pieces, is all about the Cordova carvers. And Jana, your museum loaned a hefty number of these pieces. Almost all of these pieces.
Fair.
Can you tell us a bit about the history of Cordova carving, maybe some of the distinctive attributes of Cordova carving?
Sure, yeah. So while we can kind of attribute the unpainted wood carving to Varela, sort of simultaneously and maybe a little before was Jose Dolores Lopez, who's from the town of Cordova, and he is basically, everyone who does it now is a descendant of him, and it's sort of this chip carving, and it's a little bit more, I would say, almost animated than the way that the Varela family went. So there's really this split between these two unpainted carving traditions, and very much distinct. You can tell them apart, or I can tell them apart really, really easily. And yeah, so it's really characterized by this more like chip and design work within it, and a little less sort of flowy like the Varelas, and lots of little animals.
We do.
Just one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, and I mean, especially if you take a look at that St. Francis figure in the middle, I've always kind of thought that that was just her excuse to do a whole menagerie of animals, and St. Francis was a little bit secondary.
We have a few Glorias in the collection too, like a squirrel. And every time we think about it, they're very popular. Yeah.
Can you talk about maybe why you think the animals are so popular?
They're adorable.
Okay, fair. I can't argue with that.
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if they're a little bit more universal in the sense that, as you can probably see, a lot of New Mexico art is religious in nature, where I think that the little animals are a little more secular and kind of can be a little bit more, people could relate to it and understand them a little better. That's just my opinion on that.
You have any thoughts on the animals?
I would be really speculating, but kind of along similar lines. I think that, well, but so many, St. Francis is a good example, right? Like there's so much of this interconnectedness of the natural world and spirituality. We're also talking about the natural wood. So I think I don't know, maybe the animals out in the location where the wood is gathered, are inspiring too. And they're cute.
They are so cute.
Indisputably cute. I will say one of the things that kind of surprised me whenever we were working on this section early on, particularly with some of the earlier artists, I had expected the vast majority, if not all of the work, to be religious in nature. But I was surprised to find out that much of it wasn't, and that for Jose Dolores Lopez, many of his early pieces weren't religious.
Because he made furniture.
He made furniture. And also, part of the reason we started with the animal orchestra was not only that it's adorable, because it told a bit of that story, and then he did more spiritual work as the market demanded later on. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or would that have surprised you?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, because you and I had been talking about it, I had thought a lot about it kind of sparked my idea into thinking what is sort of drawing a little bit of a line behind religion, and was curious like where that came from. So that's why I kind of went that way with those animals, thinking that, you know, there's precious little you can find in New Mexico that was made during that time that is not directly pointing to religion. So it was a bit of a surprise for me too.
Yeah, I think, I mean, thinking of the Cordova style and just the impact of kind of creating work in dialogue with people, suggesting and creating markets and things like that. I would imagine that the animals are also popular and a little bit market driven as well.
Yeah. Well, I was excited to see that a lot of that early work was kind of a focus on nature too. And that kind of helped me with this exhibition think, okay, we've got something that makes a little bit of sense here.
And we know the artists were also living in a little bit more of a sort of a little bit more remote than a lot of the other New Mexico artists, so they probably were reaching more into nature than say people who are residing in Santa Fe.
So one of the things that I like about this particular section of the show, and the show in general, is that it spans a pretty hefty swath of time. The artwork in the Cordova section represents over 100 years and many generations of artists working in this tradition in that area. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the styles change, not change? Where do you look for innovation in work that's so based in kind of a traditional way of working in such a defined aesthetic style? If that question makes sense.
Sure. Particularly with the Varelas in that style, I have noticed more of a move towards the shape and the grain and the nature of the wood. Christian and I visited the Varela family, and just having that experience where they're showing us the pieces of the wood that they picked up and, you know, what they were seeing in it, it really kind of, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I saw the change here. And then, you know, every time you see it, like, gets refined a bit as you're looking at these pieces here. The sort of the techniques become refined, the tools become refined. As far as subject matter, God, you know, you can't really, Varela started out being pretty all over the place, so it's hard to say you move towards innovation in that sense when it was kind of there already.
I have lots of thoughts about Varela that are complicated in that regard.
We'll talk more about Varela specifically in a second.
Well, part of the reason I was really excited to be a part of this panel is because the Cordova carvers are not my area of expertise. So I have been like really leaning into the ones we have in the collection and doing some more research, and was excited to learn from the both of you as well. But I think there's always this like thing where artists are like working with these traditions and upholding them, but always like adding like their own unique spin. And it's so exciting when you get to like learn about the specific styles of each of the artists. So it's just because I like Gloria's work, and that, again, the St. Francis is so gorgeous. Come on in. I think I noted on the label that it was saying that, you know, like one of the unique things about her work is that it's like kind of polished more, almost to like have this ivory quality. So I don't know. I just think like there's these moments where you start to realize that innovation is like always happening. Personal style and aesthetic is always happening, and it's exciting when you start to learn.
I think so too. I think so too. So then, wrapping up with the Cordova folks, and then we can move on to talk about the rest. Where do you see the state of this art style now? What is the current state of affairs for the Cordova carvers?
This is kind of a sad one for me, as I've been thinking about it lately, is there aren't a lot of, the Cordova family are kind of, I don't know if they're not as interested in carrying it on, which is the issue with a lot of traditions is that, you know, this is a very family-oriented tradition, specifically Cordova carving, and to So for, people are moving away now. People move, you can have that, you could teach the child, but there's a kind of a more slim chance that they'll come back and they'll continue the tradition. So there's just not a lot of Cordova carvers anymore. There's only one under 18 that I know who's even kind of learning how to do it. So that's something on my radar right now as something that I feel is a little bit in danger.
Yeah, I feel like we definitely have a better sense of that. But that's something that I was also talking to a person a piñata maker. This was years ago, but very similar types of things where there's like family traditions and trying to get the young generation to be interested in them and learning them. Sometimes that doesn't happen, or sometimes it happens later.
Yeah, I think there's actually like a lovely sort of return to culture and tradition happening as well, where a lot of the younger generations are very interested in learning their family history and learning from their elders and being. I think there is more of a tradition of more of a connection to culture. So that's a positive we can see happening.
Well, good. I'm glad we get to end that one on a positive. So moving on a little bit, Patrocinio Varela is a huge figure in this project, and all of the work that you see in this kind of central part of the gallery is by Patrocinio Varela. Both of your museums loaned fantastic pieces by him, so thank you very much for that. Do you remember when you first became aware of his work and some of your initial responses to that?
I first encountered Varela's work when I was an intern at the NHCC, and I didn't really know anything about him. I was pursuing an art history degree, but almost none of it was touching in New Mexico, as that happens a lot. And we have to fill in those gaps ourselves. So I started volunteering because I also didn't know what a curator really was or did at that time. So I'm like, I'm gonna go to this museum and start working for free and figuring out what this is all about. So of course I got to see behind the scenes and in the collections area, and the NHCC has a pretty large collection of Varelas. So that was my first encounter, and I remember actually having like a very, really feel like Varela's work kind of like draws you in, and there's like a complexity and an emotive quality that's like hard to resist. And some of them are like really tragic, which I kind of like sad things. So I'm like, I don't know. So I was just drawn to them at first. And then, ever since then, it's been like over the years of trying to learn and spend time with individual pieces and just kind of, You picked two of my favorites.
Did I? Which are they?
Worries, and the kind of taller one in the center case there, and then the death cart that's kind of off to the side there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that was deliberate. That was just
you knew you were psychically connected with my favorites. Yeah.
Jana, how about you?
Well, I mean, I am more familiar with the Varelas that are working now because of the collection that I had been working with. And as I mentioned, in grad school, my research was around the WPA, which, he was he was working during. And I think I really didn't think a lot about him until you and I started talking about him. And then I've seen pictures. I feel like he's really distinctive looking. So I had seen pictures of him during my research, but I don't think I had thought much about him until you and I started talking about him.
Okay. So in your view, can you talk a bit about Varela's place in New Mexican art history? Why is he important?
Like a lot of reasons. I think there's an element of, like, if we want to just kind of think about the work itself, that is obviously continuing to influence generations of artists in really significant ways. But he also like existed and created in a time period during the WPA era that is really significant in New Mexican history. And I think there were a lot of like cultural, economic, all of these factors changing at that time in ways that like have really continued to impact our present moment and the relationship of the arts in New Mexico. So like he's just a fascinating sort of case study to like look at all of these different intersections of, you know, sort of his own personal experience, his family's experience, the younger generations, and then, you know, just like all of the external influences that were happening. And also like an artist of that time from New Mexico getting national recognition. And so just like really significant for all of those reasons, I think.
Well, tangent time.
Tangent
For
time.
me, it represents sort of an interesting movement because, and I don't remember exactly who it was who said to him, you should try not painting them because they may be more appealing to Anglos. So during the WPA, I really feel like there was a very, I mean, it's what we consider the revival time where a lot of the traditions were introduced or reintroduced. And so there's kind of this weird dynamic of like catering towards an art market, which always brings in kind of a pro and cons list with it. So that's kind of, he marks something for me in terms of that time period. Obviously, this has gone on to become a super important art form. And, you know, yay that he did, but I really associate his work with that time period, but I also just really love the family tradition that has come out of his work that we have seen over and over again.
Well, speaking of that family tradition, how would you describe his legacy? So we know a little bit maybe about his importance to New Mexican art history, but what was his impact on younger generations? What was that importance? How do you see that importance?
I mean, it's almost, again, it's another tradition that was passed down through the family. But going and visiting the family, I tagged along on one of his trips, and my initial introduction was through Daniel, but then we went and visited Luis. And it's just exemplifies these beautiful traditions being passed down and the passion of the family and the knowledge of the family and the connection. That I like what he started there, and I'm really enjoying watching the family continue these. So for me, that's what I think of when I think of him.
I was gonna say similar things. I think, I mean, certainly there's the family whose work is like, it's fun because you can like see the inspiration of Patrocinio, but then like all of these ways of diverging from that, which is cool in their work. But you know, he had an impact on a lot of other artists, which, including Edward Gonzalez, who painted the painting.
Well, thank you for bringing up Edward Gonzalez. Jadira, your museum loaned us this beautiful portrait of Patrocinio Varela by Edward Gonzalez. Can you tell us a little bit more about him as an important cultural figure for New Mexico and the Southwest?
Yes, so yes, Edward Gonzalez is an important figure in New Mexico and the Southwest. Let's see, he was born in 1947 in Los Angeles, but his family has very deep ties to New Mexico and he grew up here. One of my favorite things about Edward Gonzalez, actually, is a little bit of a tangent, but is that he was really invested in literacy and really, as a child, sought out books and things, and that's like sort of what he credits with like helping him become an artist. And so he made a bunch of paintings that were turned into posters to promote literacy. So these posters are all over town in Albuquerque. I don't know if this happens as much in Santa Fe, but
not as much.
So one of my favorite things is just like I can talk to people who don't necessarily consider themselves to be like art people and be like, oh yeah, well, Edward Gonzalez like the posters that are hanging in Varela's coffee shop and, Cocina Azul and these different restaurants. And I'm like, oh, yeah. So he has this, like, reach and familiarity, and I think really, like, speaking to a sense of community that was important in all of his work. But, yeah, sorry, that was a digression. But
Thank you.
he, I guess, found a book of Varela's artwork when he was a kid, and at a young age kind of knew he was going to become an artist and got very inspired by Varela's work. And later, he has contributed, a few of the books up here, at least one, contributed to catalogs and exhibitions of Varela's work, and then created actually a number of portraits of Patrocinio, one of which is this one here, that was painted in 1989. It was also used as the poster for the National Association of Chicano and Chicano Studies, which is hosted in Albuquerque in 1990. So that was the poster for that one. So their work in conversation is actually really fascinating, not just because we get to see this kind of artistic interpretation of Patrocinio's image next to his work, but I think they also had kind of interesting reflections on like some of the changes, cultural shifts and changes that I think were painful for a lot of people, Hispano people in New Mexico over different time periods, and like addressed those in different ways in their work.
Great, thank you. Jana, do you have anything you would like to add to our discussion?
Sure. Well, I don't have anything to say about him.
Okay.
But I do want to say, in kind of stepping into this with you, that I really enjoyed people's depictions of Varela.
Yeah.
And finding those, like, I think we found Luis Tapia's piece on Varela, and then it really gave me more of a understanding of his reach, not just within the unpainted.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the unexpected joys of this. That portrait back there, of course, Luis Tapia, and all that work, unfortunately, isn't in the exhibition for a variety of reasons, but seeing how Varela became such an important figure for the next generation of artists, that they wanted to represent him so proudly and regularly, was, maybe that'll be the next show.
Okay. And even those working in completely different media
even
too,
those
which is like a
different
huge
media.
reach.
And in my research for this, I was able to find at least one self-portrait by Patrocinio Varela, which I found very interesting, which was done in the style of these smaller wood carvings, where he pictured himself holding the chisel and the hammer. And I always appreciate seeing how artists want to portray themselves, and with what accoutrement and in what mode. So I really enjoyed that too. So thank you for that. So the third section of this exhibition, which is back there, it's about contemporary artists from New Mexico working in the tradition of unpainted wood carving. Can you two talk about some of the artists in that part of the show that you're particularly excited about, folks working today?
I'm excited about a lot of them for a lot of different reasons. I always get nervous and I'm like, I have to pick out people. I don't want to.
I know. I never want to have to say.
I love all my children.
Exactly. I'm excited by all of you. I think, Daniel and Luis's work is really just cool to see.
And that's Daniel and Luis Varela's work.
Yeah, yes. And, but Daniel Varela as well, really gorgeous pieces in the next room. All of those, I'm actually just kind of curious, like, what your strategy was in picking the pieces over there, because they're all really phenomenal. And Sergio Tapia's piece, I love, but of course that's painted. It's not in the unpainted tradition. But I think it's a really nice example too of that always like blending of like traditional methods of creation with like contemporary topics and politics and all these things. It's doing really beautifully.
Well, do you want me to speak to that question?
I would love to, yeah.
Okay, well, this is what we talk about all day, but just really quickly, that was the most difficult and fun area to put together, because when we came to this exhibition, the idea was we're just going to work with what's in collections here in New Mexico. When we got to the contemporary part, we realized that we really couldn't stick to that the way that we wanted. So different sections came about in different ways. What we wanted to do was show a broad survey of the way the contemporary artists were working in this method. Also, echo the focus on family traditions. So, highlight those together if we could. Some of these selections came out of discussions with the artist. For Luis particularly, we worked together to see, what are the pieces that you really want to represent yourself in this exhibition, and we went with what he suggested. And there were a couple other artists who did that too. In other instances, we had very generous donors and community members who emailed me out of the blue and said, "You're doing this exhibition and you have to have these works in it." And we said, "Yeah, absolutely, we do." So special thank you to all of them. So it was a bit of a hodgepodge in that way. And then for the, there's those pieces that seem kind of like the sore thumb, right? The Tapia pieces, they're painted. There were a few reasons I wanted to include those. One was kind of as an afterword to remind people that what's going on in this gallery is just one very small narrative and a very broad and diverse and interesting story of Hispano carving in New Mexico. So I wanted to show that as kind of, since we started this section with a painted piece talking about where this is coming from, I wanted to show that that tradition was still alive and vibrant and very cool here. That was conceptually where that was coming from. More practically, and I'm sure you two can understand this, I was worried it wasn't going to be colorful enough.
Right.
So we had to put in something. And it didn't end up that way. I think it looks very good. But.
We were actually having a discussion at work about the color choices of the kind of seafoam green and the pink, and we thought it was like really beautiful. We have not ever used colors like this in our museum, but it complements the unpainted wood very well in like a subtle way. So
thank you very much.
Good design choices.
I appreciate that. I'm a sucker for a pink wall, I have to say. Jana, who are some of the contemporary artists that you're very excited about?
Well, I think Luis Tapia represents, again, another shift for me in which he starts delving into politics and socio commentary, and for me that is the most interesting art right now, is what people are saying about the community, about the world, but using this very traditional style. So I'm really leaning in towards artists who are doing that, and it's really coming from the younger and younger generations who are really knowledgeable about their traditions, but are like, well, I have something to say and I really need to say it this way. So anybody who's doing that is just so exciting to me right now. I appreciate and love the tradition so much, and I love seeing people make it their own.
So what are some of the greatest challenges that you see facing contemporary artists working in this mode today?
Well, I mean, I feel I kind of touched on that by saying that a lot of people move out and don't come back. And, the youth market, which is really where a lot of the youth learn how to market their work and share it with everyone, that stops at 18, and then they can jury into the main market. However, that's often when they're going off to college or whatnot. And so the chances of them coming back and continuing that art practice is pretty slim. So that's what I worry about. And another thing, and less so within the family traditions, but having the mentorship is so key to everything. And if they're not, properly mentored through their choice of art, they won't learn what they need to learn. And you can learn. One guy was like, "Oh, how'd you learn?" He said, "YouTube." And I was like, well, I guess that's where we're heading now. But
I learn a lot.
I do too. My dad always says, "Get on YouTube."
Yeah. Well, this video is going to be on YouTube.
That's your job. Don't tell my dad. But so it's harder, as some artists really are having to make a living elsewhere, that they don't have the time to mentor as much, which is totally understandable. And the ones who do take the time really, take on 4 or 5 kids and put in a lot of effort. My fear is in losing it that way and not really encouraging new ideas and people who want to explore different ideas. So those are my fears.
Yeah, I think related, and also this is something applicable like on a really broad scale in the arts, because I think so often there's the tension between like making what you feel compelled to make and making what can sell and help you make a living. And I think we see that tension at play in this entire exhibit, since very early on. I think that continues to be a challenge, where there's like a struggle to find like financially sustainable ways of also making your thing, and maybe people moving away because they need jobs and different stuff like that. So I think that's kind of across the board, thinking about how we create sustainability around that creative expression.
And I know post-pandemic, as a lot of artists were preparing for market, materials were huge.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of them were like, I can't do market, I can't create enough inventory because I literally can't afford to buy that much wood. And so that's sad and worrisome.
Well, I think, certainly we're here gathered in person today, and so it feels kind of like the before times. But that period of time was so scary to kind of think about how quickly that, like the platform for selling your work shifted from like a very much in-person dynamic of getting to meet people, tell them your story, show them your work in person, to photographs and online things, and costs going up, that like it's nice to be like on a different side of that. But now that it's like happened, I think that's like something to just that we're thinking about, right? Is like what does that look like in the future too?
Yeah. I'm gonna go off script.
Please.
Question, because I would love to hear your thoughts on it. One of the so the work on this exhibition, of course, comes from Museum of Spanish Colonial Art, National Hispanic Cultural Center. The Museum of International Folk Art was another major lender to this, in addition to work that was already in the Museum of Art's collection. And one of the most common questions that I get from people about this show is like, well, it's great, but why is it here? Why isn't it a folk art show? Why isn't it a Spanish colonial art show? Why isn't it at the National Hispanic Cultural Center? I would love to hear your thoughts on the way that these kind of ideas of siloing artwork into categories like folk art, Spanish colonial art, this is something that's for, maybe a Hispanic art center and not the State Art Museum, benefits and could possibly also kind of harm some of the progress in championing these narratives and these artists.
Well, I feel like that's a setup, because I have a lot of ideas on that. I struggle a little bit with the term folk art because for me, I felt like it was diminishing the work that went into it. I have since learned that some artists sort of, self-define that way, but I don't know that it does the work justice, because it's amazing work, and I think it makes it a little bit harder to kind of have a reach in terms of just sort of like being, art history is Eurocentric, so finding the words to talk about this art in general is very difficult. We don't even have the vocabulary, so it can be limiting. But when it comes down to it, it's New Mexico art. It's New Mexico's culture. It should be in all New Mexico museums. I come from a museum that has Spanish colonial in its name, and you can imagine that's super weird and limiting right now and causing a lot of conversation that I'm so happy to have, but is a little bit awkward. So for me, when I'm thinking of New Mexico, I'm not necessarily thinking of who moved here. I'm thinking about who was and is here. And this is my New Mexico that I'm looking for and I want to see represented. And so this movement towards reevaluating the institution, it's like there's a whole story here, and if you're telling part of it, you're not doing your work. So if we're not telling the Anglo side, the Hispanic side, the Native side, then we're not really doing our job anymore. That's my thoughts.
Thank you for those thoughts. They're good. I like that. Yeah, this is like loaded question for all of the different components, I think, that kind of, I don't know, so I'm just jump in. First, I think kind of what you were speaking to is this idea of that like brown people art belongs in the Brown People Museum. It's sort of like, and I work for a culturally specific museum, so this is something we're talking about all the time. And in some ways, it's incredibly liberating because we have a place focused on Hispanic and Latinx art on a global scale. We can really tease out some of the nuances and like the range of media and subject matter, and that's really exciting. But particularly in the context of the United States and in New Mexico, like this is still American art, right? It's part of our nation's history, it's part of New Mexico's history, and it needs to be represented in all of the institutions because it helps us understand the complexity of where we come from much better. So I would say if people are asking those questions, it's because you did a good thing. It's like disrupting a little bit of the expectation. But I think particularly around New Mexican artwork, it's for so long, and again, this show is very steeped in this, which is like people's kind of like narrow conceptions of what it is to be a New Mexican artist, what type of artworks people create, and sometimes often thinking that maybe like those artworks aren't relevant to contemporary times or to the national dialogue around things, which in this time period of the WPA era, we see that that's not true, right? There's a lot of dialogue going on, and certainly right now. And I think related to the word folk, I was actually, for other reasons, looking at, I think you have seen Nombre up there. And Dr. Nunn speaks about that quite well, where she talks a lot about the terminology that's used, particularly in the carving section, to describe patrocinio and other wood carvers at that time period, which is things like, you know, quaint or primitive. And so it's not to say, right, it's not to say that anyone who self-identifies as a folk artist or using the term in and of itself is bad, but I think it is to say, like, we have to think critically about how we're using those definitions and whether or not we're sort of using them as a code word for something else that has sort of maybe cultural stereotypes or something informing it. So it gets really complex, but that was all my different angles on that question.
Do you think that also the fact that it's religious in nature holds it back?
I think it sometimes contributes to this idea that, like, you know, New Mexicans are like religious and have these, you know, artworks. I don't know. But certainly there's many histories of religious artwork around the world. And a lot that is created sort of in different styles as well. So
I think that living in Santa Fe is like giving us an opportunity to be having these dialogues before anyone else, because we sit in a place that has like a ton of different cultures meeting in one place, and it is forcing a conversation that I'm actually surprised that the rest of the nation, the institutions are not really as far along with. I grew up back east, and I was visiting museums when I was back last time, and I was disappointed somewhat to find that they weren't questioning these things. And I did have to think, well, we aren't being forced into it in a wonderful and exciting way. We're being forced into having these conversations before others maybe are taking that step in, which is freaking awesome.
I have a question actually for both of you, because I was thinking about this recently when I did a visit down in Las Cruces, and so often I talk about like New Mexico itself even as this kind of like monolithic thing, but it's like such a big state, and there's lots of different experiences happening between like southern New Mexico, central New Mexico, and northern New Mexico. And so I was just curious about, like, related to this exhibition, but maybe also more generally, like your curatorial experiences in Santa Fe, because I think it's really different than mine in Albuquerque.
It totally is. It totally is, because I will say, I try and stay more on top of like a somewhat younger generation, and they aren't here. Like, I'm going to your neck of the woods to find them because they can't afford to live here. And so the audience is different here and the artists are different here. So yeah, I mean, we could be having just like polar opposite experiences.
Because we work with so many of the same artists, but I think our experiences of developing the shows, working with our audiences, and all of that is different.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I completely agree too.
Well, I started asking questions.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, for us, as the New Mexico Museum of Art, part of our mission is to represent the entire state. And it's something that we always have in the forefront of what we're doing. But particularly with the part of the collection that I work with, which is 20th century art, it can be difficult to get through the thickets of Santa Fe and Taos and look at other places, right? It's like, okay, well, I got Peter Hurt, I got Henriette Wyatt. Who else? So it's something that it can be easy to kind of get lost in the embarrassment of riches that Santa Fe and Taos provides, to look past that. But once you do, I'm almost always really excited about the new narratives and new stories and new styles and new people that we get to bring in. So yes, I guess this is a yes or no question. It's hard.
I'm curious about the different experiences.
Well, it's interesting because I was working on something and I was talking about New Mexico art. Well, a lot of these traditions are just considered northern New Mexico arts, and often Albuquerque is not part of that.
Right.
Yeah. So it does, and I like to think that's kind of spreading out as artists are mostly having to reside in Albuquerque.
Well, but some of the conversations I was having, in Las Cruces, it was just a weird moment for me, because I was like, oh yeah, like you guys are perceiving us, Albuquerque, as like northern New Mexico, but I'm like, northern New Mexico does like, so because we're central, you know. But yeah, and the traditions, expression, even the terminology we use to identify ourselves, very different from Select.
I mean, luminarias versus Floridians could start a knife fight in this very room. So I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's not as unified as culture as we'd like to think it is sometimes, which I think is good.
It is. But it's, I mean, in bringing up what you say about identifying is, I'm obviously a white girl from Maine, so I don't, when it comes to an artist identifying themselves as Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, and I know I used all the male terms of that, and I would like to acknowledge that. I have to go straight and ask the artist how they identify, because, somebody may really want to distinguish themselves by saying they're from northern New Mexico. Someone really it's important that it is said that they are from Albuquerque or something, but I
did recently work with artists who were like, we're not Hispanic, we are New Mexican.
Yeah. Legit, and like, are we, I think it's just a really interesting time to be sensitive, and I always ask people, like, what do you want a term here, and what is it? I just try not to put words in people's mouths at all, because I'm not, this is not my place of birth, and I could launch into a whole thing, and I won't, but I have thoughts.
Well, I would love to hear those thoughts, but if you don't want to go into them anymore, we'd love to hear about what projects you both have coming up that you'd like people to know about.
If you want to go, well, I dig out my flyers.
You have flyers.
I do not have flyers. So
no one let me leave today without bringing flyers. Like, this one.
So we're kind of reviving ourselves after the pandemic and ramping up and reevaluating what's important. So I'm doing a yearly youth art show. Right now I have a collaboration between Vicente Tejas and Jason Garcia, Santa Clara, and Hispanic artists, so Indian market and Spanish market artists, who have been working together on this project, and it's very cool. I have one of the younger Trujillos from Chimayo doing an exhibit on her whole family legacy of weavers, and then just really diving into some awkward conversations next summer with a show called The Ugly History of Beautiful Things, which is really talking about the very difficult histories that are producing the art that's being made now, and even, you know, like a slave blanket that was woven years and years and years ago. Well, it's a beautiful blanket, but, you know, you need to know this history is not this beautiful, wonderful fairy tale. Those are my projects.
Thank you.
Cool, those sound exciting.
Yeah, they do. Looking
I'll
forward
be
to
hanging out at your museum. We have currently 3 exhibitions up in our gallery, one of which is having an opening reception on July 14th. So I'll set some of these out here if you're interested. This is called Nexo Entre Raíces, and it's an exhibition of prints. Actually, I just hand them to you if you want one. We'll see you take it. And this is a collaborative project with an artist who organized a print exchange with artists sort of living and working on both sides of the US-Mexico border, reflecting on sort of the traditions that are borderless and that they carry with them as they move across the countries. Also, if you're into printmaking, it's an exquisite show. These artists are, the details are just gorgeous. So July 14th, we're having a DJ, food, art activities, and a panel talk with 6 of the artists. So that's free. You can come join us for that. The next would be, I guess I should just stay standing while I hand out the plates. We have also this exhibition called Aliento a Tequila y el Arte de Agave. And this exhibition just opened, and it features photography by the photographer Joel Salcido, who traveled throughout Jalisco documenting some of the original locations that made tequila. And then there's other artists as well who are looking at the significance of agave, cultural significance of agave. So we're going to have a tour of the gallery coming up soon, as well as a film screening of agave's life. And last but not least, our big project. These are not the fancy printed ones. These are from just the regular copy machine until we get these. Our big sort of culminating project this year is an exhibition called Into the Hourglass, Paño art from the Rudy Padilla collection. In 2019, we acquired a large collection of paño art, which is artworks created on handkerchiefs, often by incarcerated artists. That were amassed. It's a collection amassed by the late Rudy Padilla. So we have been doing a lot of work getting ready for this exhibition. It'll show over 100 of the paños from the collection, which there's about 300 paños in the collection as a whole, as well as artworks by artists who are dealing with themes of incarceration in their work, are also referencing the paños. And there'll be lots of programming related to that, but it opens on October 6th. Cool.
Those are also exciting.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, we're all doing cool stuff.
We're actually having an opening on October 6th.
Are
so
you?
Actually, I'm not sure about that. But if we are.
So I wanted to make sure that we had a little time, and if any of you had any questions or things you wanted to revisit.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Sure.
I was speaking before the 3 of us. That's on the problem of the 4 big pieces hanging. Are they commissioned by a church or?
That's a good question.
Another Patrocinia's work. I think the museum owns them.
Yes, we own them. They were a gift to the museum from a man named Sourwine before that. And I know that they were part of the big Varela exhibition at the Guadalupe Chapel that inspired Luis Varela to pick up the chisel and become a carver himself. I don't know exactly who commissioned Patrocinio Varela to do these, but I imagine they would have been the kind of thing that he would have been commissioned to do versus the kind of thing that he might have done a little bit more organically, just given the consistency, the style of the work, and that they were done as a series. I would imagine that, you know, for a church or for a chapel, they were probably made for that. One of the things I would like to add about those, though, is that we learned at the opening for this exhibition that Varela's son helped him carve that, which I thought was interesting because Varela's son, so Luis is his grandson.
Right.
Varela's son is always spoken about as not really having any involvement with this at all, but
no generation was missed.
Right.
You know, which I was curious. I know the family.
But he was
curious why that the son's generation were not carvers.
Well, he was.
I know. You talked about it.
I know.
And it was great because he was here. His son was here, and he was sitting by those pieces. And he said, you know, I remember helping my dad carve that. And I've got to say, if I can have a little moment to get misty for a second, I usually work with artists who are long gone. I don't work with a lot of contemporary artists, and I don't get to meet artists' families as much. So putting together this exhibition and working with so many families and getting to have these generations in the space with this work, talking about their relationship with their grandfather and projects they worked on, was unexpectedly powerful. And I think one of my favorite things about doing this.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question.
What Luis said though, the son, he was here, he's about 92, 93, so I asked him why he didn't become a carver, like his grandson and great-grand, you know, the other members of the family. And he said when he was about 8 years old, he was carving, and he cut his fingers really badly, and he never carved again. So it freaked him out. But he said he did help his father sanding somebody. He did work on the, you know, but not the actual carving part of it. I think he sanded the finishing. When he was 8 or 9 years old.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, bite me once, shame on you.
After he sliced his fingers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Anybody else?
Also,
sure.
I've been up to the family's compound up there too. And Daniel Real, and he talk about how they know wood or where they get wood. You worked for the Forest Service for 35 years.
Yeah.
And he probably saw in his backyard in his shed. He finds these great pieces of wood.
I love that you brought that up because that's some of
You
my
didn't have to
favorite
write them.
connections
You have
that
to-
happen with artists is when their like day job inspires this creative thing. It's so cool. Yeah.
Well, now he's retired now, so he has a lot more time to do carving, you know, all these things. But most of them, like the other members of the family, they've all had to work
Exactly.
these years. And Carlos, who's very talented, and you know, Carlos' work, Carlos Varela, he's not in the show or anything.
No.
Carlos, but he do a day job. So
Yeah, and
if
that's
they're a plumber or an electrician, I don't know what they were doing, but they all had to work.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and thank you two so much for your time and insight. It's always a treat to get to talk to you, and I hope we get to do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.